Thank you very much. And let me start by saying how honored I am to participate in this debate with such a distinguished panel. I'd like to thank David Ferguson from M&A, Mário Garnero, obviously, for his leadership and his participation, and Senator Chris Dodd, with whom I used to have contact when I was ambassador to the United States in Washington. I know he remains a steadfast believer in the strength of the Brazil-United States relationship, and his speech has just indicated that. I'm also very pleased to welcome to New York Senator Ferraço, the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in Brazil. Without his acquiescence, I wouldn't be here today. They approve appointments for ambassadors to foreign posts, so thank you for your presence. And very honored also to be here with colleagues from the BRICS countries, namely, in particular, Ambassador Ashok Mukherjee, my colleague at the United Nations, a permanent representative of India, a country with which we have developed a strategic partnership and very close relations also at the multilateral setting. Now, I've been asked to make some opening remarks on the BRICS, and I see that the title for our meeting today is BRICS and the World Summit, a Strategic and Political View. So I'll try to look a little bit at the strategic and political aspects of this acronym. An acronym that I think has rightly captured the imagination of politicians, diplomats, businessmen, people in the academic world, because it encapsulates one of the key elements of the accelerated changes that the world is going through today, which is the rise of certain powers. In fact, one of them, China, which will overtake the United States as the #1 economic power in terms of GDP, and several others which today are among the top 10 economies at market exchange rates or purchase parity even at a higher level, with South Africa a little bit under that threshold. And the expectation is that by 2030, China, India, Brazil, Russia will be among the top 7 in that order, and by mid-century, possibly China, India, Brazil, Russia among the top 6 in that order, with Nigeria probably having overtaken South Africa as number 13. Now, of course, these countries have different strengths. I think on the economic level, Brazil can be individualized among the BRICS as the one country that is simultaneously self-sufficient in energy, food production, water, very strong in many other natural resources. Of course, Russia is an energy powerhouse. India and China are extremely developed in terms of technology and represent extremely vibrant markets. But there are differences, and there are also some differences in terms of foreign policy, as I will point out in a moment. But interestingly also, if we look at per capita incomes for the coming decades, we will witness a curious phenomenon, which is the fact that some of these fastest growing economies that will be among the top 5 or 6 or 7 for the decades to come will not be among the top 10 necessarily in terms of per capita income. The US, in fact, will remain #1 by mid-century with the highest per capita level, followed by Canada, France, the United Kingdom, Germany, and Japan. And out of the BRICS countries, Russia is the country that will have the highest per capita, probably also because of a very quickly declining population, whereas in China, especially India, population will continue to grow very significantly, and in Brazil, by mid-century, population will have stabilized and start to decrease, or grow negatively, in other words. So I think this points to the fact that while we do have a scenario of quickly emerging powers, some of them, I think, within the BRICS already fairly established as world powers, and others experiencing global outreach for the first time in history. I think Brazil is very much in that category. This is the first time in our history, for the past decade or so, that we are truly present in all corners of the globe, not only as governments and embassies, and we are among the countries that have opened the greatest number of embassies around the world in the past decade, but also in terms of business interests and Brazilian companies being present from the South Pacific Islands to South Asia, to Central Asia, to Europe, the Middle East, Africa, as well as in the developed world. But the broader point I was going to make is that in spite of these emerging powers assuming greater economic, financial, political influence, the established powers will not submerge. They will not become submerging powers. In fact, I think there's a good term that a professor from NYU who has just put out a book called Still Ours to Lead, Bruce Jones, he calls the established powers of Western Europe, the United States, as enduring powers. They will continue to be extraordinary economic forces, forces for technological innovation, and as I've just pointed out, the countries with the highest per capita income by mid-century, which will ensure that they will remain very important markets for high-quality goods and services. And in Brazilian diplomacy, I think that there's sometimes a perception that a lot of energy is being placed in the South, in the relationship with the BRICS, and that this is at the detriment or instead of relations with the developed world. And I think this is a misperception, because what Brazil has been doing, and I think quite successfully in many ways, is establishing as close and profitable and mutually productive relations with the entire international community. In fact, we are one of 12 countries in the United Nations, and I believe India is in the same category, that has diplomatic relations with every single other UN member, which again illustrates the fact that we are today a country of truly global outreach. Now, whereas on the financial, economic, and trade fields, you may see a very strong convergence among the BRICS in shaping international outcomes. Maybe there are other areas where the overlap is not so obvious. But starting from the areas where the interests do converge very significantly, I think the reform of the international financial institutions is a good example. The BRICS countries have been fundamental actors in changing the quota distribution at the IMF and the World Bank, in fact, yet to be ratified by the US Congress. And coordination in those institutions has been considered extremely useful and productive, I think, by all the capitals of the BRICS. Similarly, in the G20 summits, there have been now, as a normal part of those gatherings, a BRICS coordination meeting prior to the G20 that establishes some common threads and some harmony in the positions that are presented. Similarly at the WTO, and now we have the BRICS present in the WTO with the recent Russian accession, even though Russia has become a WTO member, not as a developing country, which is a situation of the other BRICS members. I think it's fair to say that Roberto Azevedo, the current Director General of the WTO, might not have been elected to this position had it not been for very strong coordination among WTO members. So here's an example of how trade and economic interests can also contribute to a, let's say, political or governance outcome. But it's also fair to point out that there are other areas where the coincidence is not so obvious. For example, out of the 5 BRICS, 3 are nuclear weapon states. 2, Brazil and South Africa, are part of nuclear weapon-free zones. If we look at environmental or climate change negotiations, there's a smaller group called BASIC, made up of Brazil, South Africa, India, and China, that coordinate closely. Russia is not part of that group. In the very active discussions at the United Nations on the post-2015 agenda on the establishment of Sustainable Development Goals, the developing country or countries that define themselves as such and coordinate within the G77 China group take a more common position than Russia would take. And of course, when it comes to peace and security, 2 of the BRICS are already permanent members of the Security Council. 3 of them are actively pursuing a reform that will introduce more equitable representation into the Security Council with permanent members from Africa, Latin America, South Asia, as well as also supporting the claims of Japan and Germany for permanent membership. On the human rights front, you may also see some difference in the voting patterns, especially in Geneva at the Human Rights Council, where Brazil has only last week, for example, voted in favor of the extension of a special rapporteur for Iran and the creation of a such position for Sri Lanka, with the other BRICS countries either abstaining or voting against. And then again, if you look at peacekeeping and the United Nations, well, there are countries that have large numbers of peacekeeping. India would be first among the BRICS, followed by China, South Africa, and Brazil. Brazil with close to 2,000 troops between Haiti, but also in the Middle East and Lebanon, and now the troop commander for the Democratic Republic of the Congo, whereas Russia hardly has any peacekeepers at all. And yet, when you come to the regular budget of the United Nations, and this is a fact that few people are aware of, you actually have Brazil as a more significant contributor than Russia, which is already a permanent member. I find this could be described as a case of taxation without representation, since we are not as yet a permanent member of the UN, but very actively pursuing this cause. So I think it's very important to look at these similarities, these differences, and the fact that the investment in stronger ties collectively with the BRICS, but also individually with each one of its members on the part of Brazilian diplomacy, is not to the detriment of other strong ties, a strategic partnership with the European Union, for example, very strong ties with the United States. In fact, today we experience slightly paradoxical situation in Brazil, with China being our #1 trading partner, but a society that is much less well known by the average Brazilian than the United States, which is our #2 and still a formidable partner for trade, investment, scientific and technological cooperation, and as Senator Dodd was mentioning, the #1 destination for Brazilian students under the Science Without Borders program. I'd like just in concluding to respond very briefly, since I have the privilege of speaking after Senator Dodd, to some of the points that he made. He was mentioning that the BRICS supported Russia in its recent initiatives in Crimea, but I think it's a little more subtle than that. When there was a resolution in the General Assembly, Russia voted against this resolution, which condemned the annexation of Crimea and upheld certain UN principles and the UN Charter, and the other BRICS abstained. Now, abstention is a way of not participating in a collective condemnation, which may have been interpreted by some as slightly unconvincing, coming from countries that themselves had in the past resorted to violations of the UN Charter in order to intervene militarily in other countries. But it was also an abstention that, in the case of Brazil, reminded other UN members very strongly, and I made a statement in this sense, of our commitment to the UN Charter, and in particular to the non-use of force except in strict conformity with the Charter. The fact that a statement was adopted that signaled that suspension from the G20 would be inappropriate, I think that is a correct statement, because one single member of the G20, even though it is maybe the host for the summit, is not in a position, there are no G20 statutes, of course, it's a relatively informal gathering, is not in a position to suspend any of the others. And in terms of condemning unilateral sanctions, well, we condemn unilateral sanctions across the board. This is not something that Brazil resorts to. In fact, we only admit or conceive of sanctions that are multilaterally adopted by the Security Council, and when they are, I think we are very firm in abiding by our responsibilities in that respect. I just, as a final comment, would say that in the United Nations, Brazil has been a stalwart supporter of the important conquests that multilateralism has brought to the world over the past century. Ever since the sovereign equality of states was defended more than 100 years ago by a famous Brazilian diplomat, Rui Barbosa, up to the negotiation of the UN Charter and its important provisions on the use of force and on coercion, which we uphold very firmly, until more recent agreements internationally, including ones that foresee the provision for common but differentiated responsibilities when it comes to dealing with challenges such as climate change. I think we also very consistently point out some of the gaps, some of the shortcomings in the system, some of the areas where change should be favored very strongly. One of them I have mentioned just now, the reform of the Security Council, but not satisfying ourselves with criticizing and pointing out the gaps and lacunae. Also trying to propose ideas, propose solutions, bridges, and ways forward so that we can have a 21st century that fully delivers on the promise of a more cooperative world, a multipolarity which will not be one of confrontation, of tensions, or of rivalry, but one which will deliver better results for the largest possible number of people. Thank you very much.